Hey guys, tonight we begin with a gentle journey, not into a bustling metropolis or a crowded museum, but rather into a time most people call the Dark Ages. Yes, that vaguely scary, slightly misty period somewhere between the fall of Rome and the rise of, well, slightly less scary kingdoms. So dim the lights, grab a cup of something warm, and let's float back, slowly, to the time when Europe thought candles were a good idea and bathing was, let's say, an optional activity. Now, the term Dark Ages might make you imagine endless forests, knights brooding over swords, and peasants running around in mud. Mostly accurate if you're watching a low-budget fantasy film. But historians, those people who like checking facts instead of assuming things, have been quietly rolling their eyes for decades. You see, it wasn't actually that dark. Some parts were. A lot of parts weren't. And yet, for reasons we'll never fully understand, people like to make it sound dramatic. Maybe they were bored. Maybe dramatic titles sell books. Who knows? Anyway, let's set the scene. Rome had collapsed in the west, leaving behind empty forums, crumbling aqueducts, and a slight smell of despair. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, was still around, quietly doing paperwork, tax collection, and generally avoiding the chaos. Meanwhile, in the West, Europe became a patchwork of little kingdoms, tribal territories, and places ruled by men who wore helmets, occasionally remembered to bathe, and liked to argue about which saint was superior. One of the first figures you might meet in this gently chaotic landscape is Clovis I, king of the Franks. He was born around 466 AD, which is a nice round number if you like approximate math. Clovis is often remembered for two things: converting to Christianity and starting what might loosely be called the French monarchy. Of course, he was ambitious. Ambition was basically a hobby for royalty back then. Clovis had a tendency to marry, strategically, of course, but also because, well, that's what kings did. His wives and concubines numbered more than one, partly for love, partly for politics, and partly because succession in those days was less eldest son inherits and more whoever survives the next decade. And they did, mostly by careful alliances, although occasionally by sheer luck. One of the charming things about Clovis is that he supposedly fought in a battle called the Battle of Tolbiac against a tribe called the Alemanni. He prayed to the Christian God during the fight, which is one of those gestures historians note as politically convenient religious conversion. But let's give him some credit. It worked. The Alemanni were defeated, and Clovis converted to Christianity. Legend says he was baptized in Reims by Saint Remigius. The funny part is, we're not entirely sure if he was genuinely pious, or if he just liked the idea of divine PR. Anyway, Clovis's conversion started a trend. Soon, kings and dukes across Europe were thinking, maybe God can help me keep my lands, and also my head. This is a theme you'll notice repeatedly. In the Dark Ages, religion was less about devotion and more about survival. Or at least, that's one version of the story. Let's float over to another royal disaster, or rather, a sequence of them, that illustrates just how peculiar this period could be. Meet Merovech, the semi-legendary ancestor of Clovis. He's part historical figure, part folklore, which is convenient because nobody had cameras. Merovech is famous for his odd reputation, half legend, half semi-divine, and entirely used as a genealogical placeholder by later chroniclers who wanted to make sure the Frankish royal family looked impressive. His existence is murky, which is, honestly, a mood. Historical evidence suggests he was probably a tribal leader in what's now northern France. Chronicles, however, love to imply he might have had a sea monster ancestor, because why not? Royal lineage tends to be better with some fantastical genetics. Moving eastward, you might think the Dark Ages were uniformly quiet. They were not. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain were doing their own kind of chaos. Picture small kingdoms like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, each with a king who probably had a pet goat, a hobby of raiding neighbors, and a vague understanding of what law meant. One amusing thing about this period is that kings would often establish territories and immediately forget to secure them, leading to constant disputes. Land ownership was less about deeds and more about, "I fought you last week, I think it's mine now." Peace treaties existed, but they were mostly polite suggestions. Let's linger for a moment on King Ethelbert of Kent, who ruled in the late 6th century and early 7th century. Ethelbert is notable because he eventually converted to Christianity, thanks to a fellow named Augustine, who was sent by the Pope. Now, imagine being a king in that era. Your kingdom is small, your neighbors are aggressive, and someone shows up saying, "Hey, worship this guy in the sky, and maybe he'll protect your crops." Tempting. Ethelbert agreed. And in doing so, he set a pattern for many rulers who followed. Religion was not only comforting, it was a political tool. Meanwhile, across Europe, the so-called Dark Period was witnessing occasional bursts of intellectual activity. Monasteries, oddly enough, became centers of learning. Monks copied manuscripts, recorded local events, and occasionally produced slightly depressing illuminated texts with more gold leaf than actual practical information. Picture monks working by candlelight, silently judging each other's penmanship, and ensuring that at least some knowledge from Rome didn't completely vanish. Without them, we'd have far less understanding of what life was like in the 6th and 7th centuries. Of course, the everyday people had a different story. Life for peasants was hard, mostly because farming tools were rudimentary and taxes were imaginative. Kings and nobles demanded tribute, tithes, or fun gifts, and failure to provide them could lead to unpleasant negotiations. Peasants often had a diet that alternated between adequate and barely edible. But hey, that's history. And when famine or disease hit, well, people adapted. Or didn't. It was rarely dramatic, mostly a slow series of unfortunate events punctuated by occasional invasions. Speaking of invasions, let's talk Vikings briefly. The Dark Ages are often associated with Viking raids, which is technically accurate, but also slightly misleading. These Scandinavian visitors didn't arrive all at once. They trickled in, mostly along rivers, looking for trade, loot, and the occasional monastery to occupy. Their raids were organized, but not constant. People who picture non-stop pillaging are watching the wrong documentaries. That said, their appearance added another layer of stress to European elites who had enough trouble managing their own family disputes, territorial claims, and minor theological disagreements. Now, we can't discuss the Dark Ages without acknowledging the slightly tragic pattern of royal inbreeding, which was not unique to this era, but was beginning to set some interesting precedents. Many royal families married cousins or more distant relatives, partly to keep lands consolidated, partly because travel was inconvenient, and partly because they thought it looked impressive on a family tree. The results varied. Some rulers emerged perfectly healthy, others less so. This would become a running theme in European history, but seeds were being planted even during this early period. Let's pause to consider Childeric II, another Merovingian king who inherited the kingdom of Austrasia. Childeric's reign was marked by a subtle blend of charm, mismanagement, and chronic illness. He had the unfortunate habit of dying relatively young, leaving the kingdom in the hands of his offspring or assorted nobles who immediately argued over his territories. Dynastic instability was basically a feature, not a bug in the Dark Ages. These stories are endlessly fascinating if you enjoy watching adults behave like overgrown children, which, let's be honest, is half the fun of history. Moving west again, you might meet Dagobert I, called the Just by some, and the occasionally reasonable king by others. Dagobert ruled the Franks in the early 6th century. He was energetic, ambitious, and fond of displays of wealth. He established royal domains, reorganized administration, and was generally competent, but was also reportedly had a temper. Dagobert's life reminds us that even kings could be flawed, occasionally cruel, and entirely human. Their mistakes often rippled through the lives of their subjects, but in a very slow, nobody dies today, maybe tomorrow kind of way. By now, you might notice a pattern emerging. The Dark Ages are less about catastrophe and more about gradual, uneven change. Empires fade, tribes rise. Kings marry, bicker, and occasionally die tragically. Meanwhile, everyday people continue their lives with minimal fanfare. There's humor here, if you like observing.
Welcome back, friends. Now that we've settled into the soft glow of the Dark Ages, let's gently wander into the palaces, halls, and occasionally drafty chambers of Europe's early medieval royalty. Here, power often came with crowns, spoons, and the persistent inconvenience of other people who wanted your crown. Let's float slowly over these lives, one mildly dysfunctional dynasty at a time. One family that sets the mood nicely is the Merovingian dynasty of the Franks. You might remember Clovis I from our last segment. His descendants, well, let's just say they took the family tradition of unpredictability to a new level. Imagine a line of kings whose daily routines involved bickering over trivial territories, drinking too much, and occasionally forgetting that someone was supposed to inherit their lands. They were called the long-haired kings because apparently hair length signified royal legitimacy. Yes, seriously, hair was a status symbol. Long hair, political power. Short hair, questionable authority. It's a surprisingly soothing metaphor for a time when appearances mattered slightly more than efficiency. Take Clothar II, for example. He lived in the 7th century and is remembered for being a relatively competent ruler, but also for surviving constant family drama. Clothar's father, Sigebert I, had the habit of dying in inconvenient ways, leaving his children to negotiate power while still learning how to walk. Clothar was a child of political necessity, groomed from a young age to navigate the slightly confusing world of Frankish succession. As a child, he probably spent his time learning Latin phrases, nodding politely at court officials, and wondering why grown-ups cared so much about borders drawn on maps nobody ever visited. And speaking of children, the Dark Ages were full of royal kids who grew up fast and often oddly unprepared for adult life. Infant mortality was high, so monarchs often treated their surviving children like fragile porcelain or spoiled little tyrants. Many were expected to inherit kingdoms before they could even pronounce their own names correctly. Imagine ruling a territory with the vocabulary of a toddler. That's basically medieval Europe in a nutshell. Let's drift gently toward the British Isles. Here, kings like Edwin of Northumbria and Oswald of Bernicia offer glimpses into personal eccentricities that could quietly determine the fate of nations. Edwin reportedly had a tendency toward paranoia, which is understandable if you grow up in a place where neighbors regularly raid your home and your cousin might assassinate you over a sheep. Oswald, meanwhile, combined devout Christian faith with the occasional overzealous military decision, probably because his chroniclers wanted to make him appear more saintly than he actually was. Subtle exaggeration was a family hobby back then. Moving east again, we meet Theodebert I, King of Austrasia. Theodebert was charming in a slightly uncomfortable way. Chroniclers note that he liked fine clothing, elaborate jewelry, and ceremonial displays, which made him popular at court. But Theodebert's personal habits, especially his fondness for extravagance, often clashed with his kingdom's economic reality. Picture him strolling through a palace, decked in gold, while advisors whispered about taxes and crops. He probably didn't care. After all, a king in the Dark Ages could always blame fate or the local bishop if things went wrong. Speaking of bishops, the intertwining of church and royalty is a gentle, ever-present theme. Many kings relied on religious figures not just for moral guidance, but for legitimation of their sometimes questionable actions. If a bishop declared your coronation divinely sanctioned, it was remarkably hard to argue, even if your cousin was already sitting in the other room, claiming the same throne. This created situations that were less dramatic than you might expect, but quietly humorous in retrospect. Imagine two cousins arguing over legitimacy while a calm, candlelit priest simply sighed and said, "Well, God decides, I suppose." Let's linger for a moment on Clotilde, wife of Clovis I. Clotilde's life exemplifies the subtle tragedies and gentle absurdities of royal existence. She was devout, politically astute, and remarkably patient, necessary qualities when your husband is prone to sudden wars and unpredictable mood swings. Chroniclers admired her piety, and she influenced Clovis's conversion to Christianity. But she also experienced the quiet sorrow of losing children and navigating court intrigues. Life as a queen was less about opulent banquets and more about negotiating with fate on a daily basis, usually while wearing uncomfortable silk. Meanwhile, over in the Lombard Kingdom of Italy, Queen Theodelinda shows us another side of royal life. She was intelligent, politically savvy, and devoutly Catholic. Her main hobby seemed to have been subtly shaping the kingdom's religion while keeping an eye on her husband's occasional temper tantrums. Theodelinda's life was peaceful by comparison to some of her contemporaries, but she was constantly aware of the fragile balance between devotion, politics, and personal comfort. She is a reminder that queens often did more behind the scenes than anyone else noticed. Now, let's drift toward child rulers, which are a particular source of gentle amusement. Consider Sigebert III of Austrasia, who inherited the throne at the age of 4. Yes, 4. He was essentially a toddler ruler, advised by regents and surrounded by nobles who mostly argued about which toys, or territories, they would take next. Sigebert's reign demonstrates a recurring theme in the Dark Ages. Even tiny humans could wield enormous influence, mostly because nobody else wanted to die trying to claim it. And it's not just the children. Many adult kings were slightly fragile or sickly, often due to inbreeding or the simple consequences of a harsh medieval lifestyle. Fevers, digestive problems, and occasional mental lapses were recorded, sometimes exaggerated, in chronicles. The effect was a line of rulers who were perfectly human, but looked heroic or tragic through the lens of medieval storytelling. It's oddly comforting to realize that even people with crowns, armies, and influence could be as delicate as a well-baked loaf of bread. As we drift over the Germanic kingdoms, it's hard to ignore the subtle comedy of dynastic marriages. Kings often married cousins or distant relatives to consolidate power, which sometimes led to confusing family trees. Imagine a royal family reunion where everyone is both uncle and niece at the same time. This is history, not sitcom, but it has a similar gentle absurdity. Genetic quirks and occasional illnesses became fodder for chroniclers, who loved to note them in a tone somewhere between horror and bemusement. And of course, the everyday oddities of court life added texture. Some kings had peculiar eating habits, others hoarded small treasures. Advisors often argued in monotonous tones about taxes, boundaries, and ceremonial etiquette. Life was slow, deliberate, and occasionally ridiculous. Yet these small details, child kings, sickly rulers, elaborate weddings, and ceremonial absurdities give us a surprisingly intimate window into the Dark Ages. It wasn't all battles and plagues. Sometimes it was just tedious courtly life, mildly stressful weather, and the occasional uncomfortable family reunion. We end this segment gently on the figure of Dagobert I, whom we mentioned last time. Dagobert's personal habits, charm, and occasional mismanagement illustrate the broader theme. Kings were human. They could be competent, flawed, charming, or irritating, all at once. And their lives, while not exciting in the modern sense, provide endless, subtle amusement for anyone who enjoys watching history unfold like a quiet, slow-moving river.
Welcome back, friends. If you've been comfortably settled so far, tonight we continue our gentle exploration of medieval royalty, where crowns, family trees, and mildly inconvenient personal habits intertwine in a slow, almost hypnotic rhythm. Let's float, very slowly, into the next layer of courtly life. One of the enduring themes of the Dark Ages is inbreeding, which sounds dramatic but often played out in quiet, subtle ways. Royal families weren't trying to create dramatic disasters. They mostly just wanted to keep land, titles, and influence in the family. Sometimes this led to mildly unfortunate genetic quirks, which chroniclers were delighted to record with a hint of bemused horror. Take the Merovingians again. Several kings married cousins, cousins of cousins, or the occasional more distant relative, which was considered perfectly normal. You might end up with a king who had a slightly unusual appearance, a chronic illness, or a personality best described as eccentric. For instance, Childeric III, often remembered as the last Merovingian king, was reportedly weak, timid, and somewhat forgettable. His reign ended quietly, with Pope Stephen II approving his deposition. The irony is gentle. Centuries of dynastic politicking, complex alliances, and family drama culminated in a man so unremarkable that the Pope could simply say, "Well, you're done," and the kingdom continued on its way. There's something soothing about that, isn't there? History doesn't always explode in dramatic battles. Sometimes it just sighs quietly and moves on. Now let's drift east to the Lombard kingdom in Italy, where royals exhibited charmingly mundane but ultimately tragic quirks. King Rothari, for example, was known for codifying laws and trying to impose order, a remarkably administrative hobby for a king. Yet his personal life had its own gentle complications. Marriages, alliances, and occasional disputes with nobles created a slow, almost imperceptible tension that historians later interpreted as turbulent reigns. In reality, Rothari's court probably resembled a slightly chaotic office with less paperwork and more elaborate feasts. Speaking of feasts, medieval royals often had peculiar eating habits. Some preferred extremely bland diets, Others indulged in excess. Chroniclers note kings and queens consuming odd combinations, sometimes due to superstition. For example, eating certain meats was thought to influence courage, while specific breads could supposedly improve fertility. There's no evidence this worked, of course, but it's soothingly human to imagine a king carefully choosing a slice of bread to enhance his martial prowess, only to be mildly disappointed when nothing happened. Floating northward, we encounter the Anglo-Saxon kings, many of whom had children whose survival was uncertain and whose future responsibilities were overwhelming. Consider Edgar the Peaceful, who ruled England in the late 9th century. Despite the nickname, he had to manage constant familial rivalries and noble intrigues. His life shows us a subtle contrast, outwardly serene, yet inwardly preoccupied with succession planning, personal relationships, and the occasional minor rebellion. He is a gentle reminder that peaceful is often a relative term, especially when your court is full of ambitious cousins and advisors who specialize in paperwork disputes. Now, let's linger a moment on child monarchs again. Early medieval Europe had plenty. Children could inherit crowns before learning how to read, much less negotiate a treaty. Sigebert III and others illustrate this perfectly. Toddlers ruling nations, while regents whispered, advised, and occasionally argued over cake or territory. These child rulers often grew up to be mildly eccentric adults, their early experiences shaping their personalities in ways chroniclers found endlessly noteworthy. Moving west, we encounter the Carolingians, whose line introduced an additional layer of complexity. Charlemagne looms large in history books, but his children and grandchildren offer fascinating glimpses into dynastic oddities. Charlemagne's sons were assigned territories and responsibilities before they were fully equipped to handle them. Some failed quietly, others were remarkably competent, but all of them demonstrate the gentle chaos that can emerge when ambition, youth, and power collide slowly over time. Now, speaking of chaos, let's examine royal eccentricities. Kings and queens often had peculiar hobbies or emotional tendencies. Some were devout to the point of daily ritual. Others were prone to emotional meltdowns over trivial matters, such as losing a hunting dog or misplacing a ceremonial robe. Take Lothari II, a Carolingian king, who spent much of his reign entangled in marriage disputes, ecclesiastical approvals, and family quarrels. The stress of such conflicts might have led to mild irritability, or so the chroniclers politely noted. We can imagine Lothari sighing gently at court, muttering under his breath about relatives, while advisors tried not to look concerned. Meanwhile, in the Frankish kingdoms, Queen Brunhilde offers a case study in subtle power dynamics and long-term frustration. She was intelligent, politically ambitious, and endured decades of court intrigues. Brunhilde's life was full of minor tragedies, familial betrayals, political setbacks, and the persistent inconvenience of people underestimating her. Yet she navigated it all with remarkable calm, at least outwardly, illustrating a recurrent pattern. Royal life in the Dark Ages was less about battles and more about patience, endurance, and occasional quiet cunning. And let's not forget the absurdities of dynastic succession. Often, kingdoms split into smaller, technically independent territories upon a ruler's death, only to reunite decades later, or remain awkwardly fragmented. This created situations where cousins ruled neighboring lands with slightly overlapping authority, leading to minor but persistent diplomatic tensions. There were no dramatic battles every week, just subtle disagreements, ceremonial arguments, and the occasional quiet threat, all unfolding at a pace that's almost hypnotic to consider. It's also worth noting the role of illness and fragile health. Many rulers were described as weak, prone to fevers, or chronically unwell, sometimes due to genetics, sometimes due to the harsh realities of medieval life. This added another layer of gentle unpredictability. A king might rise to power only to be limited by minor ailments, leaving regents and advisors to make slow, cautious decisions. History often notes these details with a tone somewhere between pity and amusement. As we drift into the latter half of this segment, it becomes clear that the Dark Ages were a time of slow, deliberate, often quietly tragic human drama. Kings married cousins, children inherited crowns, advisors whispered, and chroniclers observed with polite bemusement. There were no explosive events every hour, no constant battlefield carnage, just decades of subtle mismanagement, eccentric personal habits, and the occasional minor political miracle. Finally, we pause at Theuderic III, another Merovingian king, whose reign is notable primarily for endurance. He survived long enough to see multiple rivals pass away, maintain his tenuous authority, and leave descendants who would continue the delicate, almost hypnotic cycle of succession, alliances, and minor tragedies. There's something oddly comforting about this. History doesn't always have to scream or shock. Sometimes it can just glide past, leaving us with stories of humans navigating slightly inconvenient circumstances with mild determination. In the next segment, we'll explore even more dynastic quirks, family tragedies, and the slightly absurd personal habits of rulers, moving gently toward the end of our Dark Ages journey. We'll meet kings who indulged in peculiar routines, queens who subtly controlled politics, and the delicate patterns that shaped the early medieval world.
Welcome back, friends. By now, you're comfortably floating through the so-called Dark Ages, where crowns, family trees, and mildly inconvenient personal habits dominate the scene. In this segment, we'll focus on the slightly absurd, quietly tragic, and often peculiar lives of medieval rulers, where inbreeding, eccentricity, and small-scale disasters subtly shape the course of history. Let's begin with the quirks of inbreeding, which is easier to observe in hindsight than it was to avoid at the time. Royal families liked cousins. Distant cousins were considered acceptable. Sometimes the distant part was more creative than factual. The goal was consolidation of lands, titles, and influence, not necessarily genetic health. But the results, occasionally amusing or slightly concerning. Certain Merovingian kings had pronounced physical oddities, chronic illnesses, or tendencies that modern historians politely describe as subtle genetic consequences. Gentle reminder, history doesn't need dramatic wars to be fascinating. Sometimes it's just a small nose here, a chronic ailment there, and the occasional slightly bewildered king. Take Charles the Simple, a Carolingian king whose reign was less strategic genius and more mildly unfortunate circumstances and indecisive advisors. Charles had children and relatives intermarrying with neighboring dynasties, producing both alliances and small, persistent problems. Eventually, he was deposed quietly, exiled, and left to live a life that chroniclers describe with mild pity and occasional exasperation. He's the kind of ruler's life you could almost fall asleep to, except for the occasional whisper of mild tragedy that keeps the mind gently engaged. Meanwhile, in Aquitaine and Burgundy, we find similar patterns. Kings often married for convenience, producing children who were heirs in name, but not always in capacity. Some were sickly, some were charmingly eccentric. All were caught in a network of obligations, minor political crises, and the subtle inconvenience of other nobles thinking their opinions mattered. Life in court was not loud. It was slow, deliberate, and occasionally absurd in the most gentle way. Now let's consider royal eccentricities more closely. Some kings preferred elaborate clothing and rituals, devoting hours to carefully arranging jewels, robes, or even table settings. Others indulged in private hobbies, collecting small animals, writing poems no one read, or insisting on daily rituals that advisors quietly tolerated. One king reportedly had an obsession with a specific type of horse, so much so that minor disputes could arise over its care, feeding, or ceremonial display. These small habits are not dramatic. They are quietly human. They remind us that behind every crown is a person with mild obsessions, persistent quirks, and occasional impractical routines. Let's drift toward the queens, who often bore the brunt of dynastic pressures, yet exerted influence in subtle ways. Queen Fredegund is a good example. She was intelligent, ambitious, and deeply aware of courtly politics. Her life involved navigating betrayals, family disputes, and her own occasional inconvenient health issues. Fredegund is remembered as clever, calculating, and, from a modern perspective, quietly impressive. She demonstrates that power didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, maneuvered, and waited. Across Europe, similar patterns emerge. Princesses and young queens were often married off as toddlers or children, intended to cement alliances. Imagine being 5 years old and suddenly hearing, "Congratulations, you're now married to the king of a neighboring land." Adaptation skills were crucial, but so was patience. Many grew up mildly resentful, occasionally manipulative, and perfectly capable of influencing politics through small gestures, subtle advice, or carefully timed emotional expressions. Let's pause at Lothar II, a Carolingian king, whose life was defined by marriage controversies, minor health issues, and slow-moving political entanglements. Lothar's personal habits, documented in the most understated chronicler's tone, include slight impulsivity, occasional indulgence in luxury, and a persistent worry about succession. His reign, like many others, is a quiet story of human flaws, societal expectations, and the slow unfolding of consequences that ripple gently through dynasties. Meanwhile, minor dynastic disasters accumulated quietly. Cousins married cousins, lands fragmented, and treaties were occasionally forgotten. These weren't dramatic catastrophes, they were subtle inconveniences that compounded over decades. Chroniclers loved noting them, often with a gentle mix of irony and bemusement. One day, a king would inherit a border he didn't want. Another day, a queen would discover that an alliance had shifted subtly without her consent. Over time, these small moments
created patterns historians find endlessly interesting. In Northern Europe, kings like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark offer examples of slow, personal quirks shaping history. Harald converted to Christianity, partly for faith, partly for political convenience, and reportedly had eccentric habits involving construction projects, monuments, and mild family disputes. His son later inherited a kingdom where the seeds of these quiet complications had subtly taken root. This is not dramatic history. It's the soft, almost hypnotic rhythm of human behavior in the context of medieval expectations. And let's not overlook the mundane tragedies, infant deaths, frequent illness, and courtly miscommunication. These events were unremarkable at the time, but recorded in careful detail by chroniclers who seem to have an appreciation for mild irony. A child king might inherit a throne only to outlive his advisors. A queen might plan a marriage alliance for circumstances to shift subtly. In the grand scheme, these are small, gently tragic events, but fascinating when observed slowly. Floating toward the later Merovingians and early Carolingians, we notice a pattern of quiet eccentricity and fragile health. Kings were human, easily fatigued, sometimes obsessive, occasionally stubborn, and frequently reliant on the gentle counsel of priests, advisors, and slightly overworked scribes. Their lives were less a series of dramatic battles than a continuous series of small, human events that shaped succession, policy, and alliances. Finally, let's consider minor royal rituals. Some kings insisted on daily prayers at specific hours. Others conducted court ceremonies that were meticulous to the point of tedium. Advisors quietly endured these routines, nobles found workarounds, and chroniclers observed with mild amusement. These small details illustrate the human side of history. It's not always loud, dramatic, or violent. Sometimes it's quiet, repetitive, and slightly absurd. As this segment closes, it's clear that the Dark Ages were not uniformly dark, nor uniformly tragic. They were gentle, slow-moving, and full of human quirks. Kings, queens, and children navigated obligations, eccentricities, and mild misfortunes in a rhythm that seems hypnotic from our.
Welcome back, friends. As we continue our leisurely journey through the Dark Ages, it's time to observe how European kingdoms evolved, often quietly, sometimes awkwardly, and nearly always with an undercurrent of mild irony. Here, dynasties continued their gentle dance of ambition, eccentricity, and occasional mismanagement. Let's drift slowly into these centuries of low-key drama. One of the key patterns of this period is fragmentation and slow consolidation. Kingdoms often split when a ruler died, only to reunite decades later, or remain oddly divided. The Frankish kingdoms offer a perfect example. After the death of Clovis I, his sons inherited different regions. This wasn't a dramatic catastrophe. It was a slow, deliberate process of negotiation, marriage alliances, and occasional mild conflict. You can almost imagine the courtiers politely debating borders over cups of watered wine, while kings sighed and nodded, hoping everyone would eventually get tired and leave. Meanwhile, the Carolingian dynasty began to rise.
Charlemagne looms large in our historical imagination, but his predecessors and contemporaries were a quiet, slightly eccentric bunch. Early Carolingians managed lands carefully, sometimes overreaching and sometimes mildly underachieving. These subtle fluctuations in competence and ambition created patterns that historians find endlessly interesting. Small mistakes compounded, minor alliances failed, and eccentric personal habits occasionally shaped policy. Let's drift northward to Scandinavia, where the Viking presence began influencing the slow evolution of kingdoms. Rather than dramatic non-stop raiding, Viking incursions were intermittent, unpredictable, and gently irritating. They prompted kings in Britain, Francia, and elsewhere to manage defenses, negotiate treaties, and occasionally reassign courtiers, all with the calm, measured concern of people trying to maintain fragile borders. It's an almost hypnotic rhythm: arrival, mild disruption, adjustment, and gradual stabilization. Meanwhile, courts were full of quirky individuals whose personal habits influenced history in small, subtle ways. Some kings were obsessive about horses, others about clothing, and a few about the occasional small household pet. Queens often exerted influence quietly, shaping alliances, marriages, and policy, without dramatic displays. The resulting history is less about battles and more about human behavior: eccentric, mildly inconvenient, but strangely captivating when observed slowly. In the Frankish world, minor dynastic disasters continued to ripple. Children inherited crowns before learning to speak properly. Nobles argued over borders with polite but persistent intensity, and advisors whispered behind the scenes. Chroniclers noted every subtle mishap, often with a tone of bemused exasperation. It's this gentle irony, slow, human, and almost hypnotic, that gives the Dark Ages its enduring charm. Let's pause on Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son. Louis inherited a massive empire and a long list of minor obligations. His reign involved careful negotiations with sons, nobles, and the church. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes he failed quietly. Chroniclers recorded everything: his pious habits, his occasional irritability, and his struggles with succession planning. Louis's life is a testament to the soft, slow-moving rhythm of history in this period. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate, tedious, occasionally frustrating, and endlessly human. Meanwhile, medieval queens continued their quiet influence. Women like Ermengarde and Bertrada navigated court politics, subtly directing decisions, marriages, and alliances. They were patient, clever, and adept at working within constraints imposed by society and family. Their contributions are often understated in the historical record, but their influence shaped dynasties, subtly affecting European history in ways that might go unnoticed if you weren't paying attention to the gentle patterns of court life. Now, let's drift to child monarchs, who remained a recurring theme. Children inheriting crowns meant regencies, advice, and occasional mild confusion. These early rulers often grew into eccentric adults, shaped by the peculiarities of their upbringing and the gentle pressures of dynastic responsibility. Their lives are perfect examples of how personal habits, health, and temperament quietly ripple through history. Even the slow-moving church influence adds to the hypnotic pattern of the Dark Ages. Bishops and abbots often mediated disputes, advised kings, and occasionally pointed out mild mismanagement. They were the quiet, guiding presence behind the scenes, like calm librarians ensuring that the messy human story didn't spiral entirely out of control. Their subtle interventions shaped policy,
succession, and alliances, gently nudging the course of kingdoms in ways that are easy to miss if you're only looking for dramatic battles. As the centuries progressed, kingdoms slowly stabilized, dynasties consolidated, and minor mishaps accumulated into patterns. The darkness of the period is mostly a matter of perception. Chroniclers like to exaggerate inconveniences and failures for stylistic effect. In reality, life was a series of calm, deliberate steps. Rulers married, children were born, nobles negotiated, and advisors whispered. The subtle interplay of ambition, eccentricity, and occasional mismanagement shaped history with quiet elegance. Finally, consider the gentle humor in these patterns. Kings obsessed with trivial matters, queens influencing politics without dramatic flair, children learning governance before they could write their own names, all contribute to the soft irony of the Dark Ages. There are no epic explosions, there are no constant catastrophes, just centuries of slow human behavior unfolding in rhythm, quietly leaving traces that historians observe with patient curiosity and a touch of bemusement. As this segment closes, it becomes clear that the Dark Ages are less dark and more slowly unfolding human story, filled with eccentricities, subtle disasters, and quiet dynastic drama. The period's fascination lies not in the dramatic, but in the mundane. Marriages, minor political disputes, child rulers, eccentric habits, and the gentle persistence of humanity in a world adjusting to the absence of Rome. In the next segment, we will gently conclude our journey through the Dark Ages, reflecting on the subtle lessons of patience, human folly, and the hypnotic patterns of medieval life, leaving you with a calm understanding of this strangely captivating era.
Welcome back, friends. As we settle into the final leg of our journey, let's allow ourselves to linger on the slowly unfolding, quietly fascinating world of the Dark Ages. This is a period often mischaracterized as uniformly chaotic or grim, but as we've observed, its true rhythm is subtle, deliberate, and oddly soothing. By now, we've met kings and queens who were spoiled, sickly, eccentric, or clever in ways that didn't always show outwardly. We've observed child rulers navigating responsibilities they weren't quite ready for. We've seen dynasties consolidate slowly, fragment awkwardly, and occasionally survive minor disasters that chroniclers found endlessly noteworthy. The beauty of this era lies not in grand battles or constant upheaval, but in the gentle patterns of human behavior that quietly shaped history. Take, for instance, the recurring theme of child monarchs. From Sigebert III to Lothar II, these young rulers remind us that history doesn't always unfold with dramatic fanfare. Instead, it moves like a river, patient, gradual, and occasionally interrupted by mild turbulence. Childhood and youth in royal life meant early exposure to ambition, subtle manipulation, and minor disappointments, all of which would shape personality and policy in ways historians now find fascinating and narrators find hypnotically relaxing. Meanwhile, the queens of this period quietly molded their worlds. Women like Clotilde, Fredegund, and Theodelinda wielded influence not through spectacle, but through patience, subtle advice, and careful navigation of courtly intrigues. Their power was understated, almost invisible, but profoundly effective over the long term. Watching them act, one notices a slow, deliberate intelligence that gently reminds us that history is made as much by whispers as by shouts. Even the minor dynastic disasters hold a peculiar charm. Cousins marrying cousins, lands fragmenting, treaties quietly ignored, these were not catastrophic events.
They were gentle inconveniences, compounded over time, leaving historians the delightful task of tracing their consequences. Consider Charles the Simple, whose quiet depossession and exile illustrate the soft irony of medieval life. Even kings with crowns and armies could be quietly sidelined by circumstance and familial expectation. As kingdoms gradually stabilized, patterns became more evident. Eccentric personal habits, from obsessive clothing preferences to unusual dietary rituals, subtly shaped policy and succession. Inbreeding produced mild genetic quirks that chroniclers noted with polite exasperation. Advisors and clerics worked behind the scenes to ensure that the small machinery of governance continued to function, often with quiet effectiveness. It is this accumulation of subtle events, quiet, patient, and often mildly absurd, that gives the Dark Ages its hypnotic rhythm. We've seen that the so-called darkness is mostly a matter of perception. Without Rome's vast bureaucracy, chroniclers noticed small inconveniences more, and later historians dramatized them further. But in reality, people lived, grew, and died in a gentle pattern of persistence and adaptation. Life included minor tragedy, eccentricity, and quiet human folly, but also resilience, intelligence, and subtle ingenuity. Let's pause to reflect on the soft humor in history. Kings worried about trivial matters. Queens subtly influenced political outcomes. Children ruled before they could read. Advisors whispered endlessly. Chroniclers observed patiently. Over centuries, these small, repetitive patterns produced dynasties, territories, and alliances that would influence Europe for generations. It is not dramatic history. It is quiet, human, and profoundly hypnotic when experienced slowly, like the gentle ticking of a clock or the soft rustle of leaves in a calm forest. As we conclude, it's worth noting the enduring lessons of the Dark Ages. Patience, subtlety, and human imperfection shaped everything. Life rarely required dramatic heroism. It demanded endurance, observation, and occasionally clever manipulation of small circumstances. Royalty, with all its eccentricities and mildly tragic flaws, becomes relatable in its imperfection. The period invites us to see history not as a series of explosive events, but as a slow, fascinating journey of humans navigating a complex, imperfect world. So as you lean back, dim the lights a little further, and allow yourself to drift, remember this: the Dark Ages were not a time of uniform gloom. They were a period of subtle, gentle human behavior unfolding across generations, quietly dramatic, mildly absurd, and endlessly hypnotic. Kings, queens, children, and advisors each played their parts, leaving patterns that ripple softly through history. And as we float to the end of our journey tonight, let us appreciate the calm rhythm of an age where patience, eccentricity, and quiet human folly were the true rulers of Europe. Sleep well, and let the slowly turning centuries carry you into dreams of long-haired kings, eccentric queens, and the hypnotic, gentle pulse of the Dark Ages.